On a hot and sticky morning in August of 1976, 44-year-old Mabalo Loella woke up drenched in sweat. It was his first morning back in his remote village of Yambuku in the country of Zaire, and he didn't feel right. Mabalo was the school headmaster in a poor community that lacked basic necessities like phones, running water, and electricity. He could almost never afford the luxury of a real vacation, but he had spent the past 2 weeks traveling Zaire's rainforests. He'd visited friends and family and spent some time hunting rainforest game like monkeys, antelope, and red river hogs. He'd had a great time, even though toward the end of the trip, he developed a persistent headache that developed into a fever. On the last morning, he woke up feeling shaky and nauseous, which made the long van ride back home absolutely awful. Mabalo had hoped that a good night's sleep in his own bed would help him feel better, but now, as he lay there staring up at the ceiling, he was feeling even worse. His stomach was churning and he felt a bit dizzy too. He could tell this fever was not about to go away on its own. He needed medication. The only medical care that was available was a local clinic that was staffed by Belgian nuns and a few villagers. There were no doctors, and the clinic was really just set up to provide prenatal care for pregnant women. But usually, the nuns did have enough medication to tend to the village's basic medical needs. So Mabalo dragged himself out of bed, careful not to disturb his sleeping wife. He fished a clean shirt out of his travel bag, and then made the long walk from his home down the dirt road all the way to the clinic. 20 minutes later, Mabalo felt weary from walking in the morning sun, but he could see the distinctive red metal roofs of the complex that housed the clinic just ahead. He felt grateful that these nuns from so far away had come to live in their village, especially today. He really needed their help. Once Mabalo had crossed the clinic's courtyard and stepped through the door, he felt a bit better. It was still cool inside, since the sun had not been up long enough to warm the building up yet. He looked down the row of beds, all kept impeccably tidy, and then he looked along one wall, and he saw a nurse was putting a few pill bottles into a row of beat-up supply cabinets. Mabalo knew this nurse. He was a local man who was named Sakado, who worked for the nuns. Sakado waved, and then asked Mabalo what brought him to the clinic that morning. Mabalo pointed at his head and said he'd been sick with a headache and fever for days. Sakado nodded sympathetically and asked Mabalo to have a seat in one of the little folding chairs by the door. One of the nuns would be over to talk to him shortly. As soon as Mabalo sat down, he closed his eyes and leaned his aching head back against the cool cement wall. He was lost in a daydream when he heard the click of footsteps on the clay tile floor, and then a soothing voice spoke his name. He opened his eyes to greet a short Belgian nun in a white linen dress. The nun pulled down the cotton face mask she was wearing and introduced herself as Sister Adela. She beckoned him over to one of the beds and told him he was welcome to lie down while she took his vitals, and so Mabalo happily obliged. After a quick exam, the nun told Mabalo that he probably had malaria, a disease carried by mosquitoes that runs rampant in much of Africa. It's usually characterized by fever and flu-like symptoms, just like Mabalo had. And so, Sister Adela moved over to the worn cabinets along the wall and pulled out a syringe that was full of clear liquid. She explained that the liquid was a medication called quinine, which treated malaria. Sister Adela gently stuck the needle into Mabalo's left arm and then pushed the medicine inside of him, and then she set the syringe aside and put a bit of cotton over the drop of blood from the needle. She told Mabalo to go home and take a nap, and he'd be back to normal in a couple of days. Mabalo thanked her, then slowly stood up and made his way out of the clinic. 8 days later, Mabalo's wife, Mbuzu, spooned some broth into a bowl and set it beside the bed she shared with her husband. She tied her long braids with a strip of leather and slipped into her shoes by the door. Her shoes looked miniature next to Mabalo's shoes. He towered over her when they stood side by side. But now, as he was curled up in bed, she thought he looked so small. Mabalo was still sick despite having gone to the clinic. In fact, after visiting the clinic, he came back and developed diarrhea and was vomiting so much that Mbuzu thought that he must be dangerously dehydrated. Her husband was so weak he couldn't even get out of bed. Mbuzu knew she needed to get her husband more help, so she told Mabalo she'd be right back, and she started walking to the clinic herself. When Mbuzu stepped into the clinic, she saw Sister Adela tending to a patient. Mbuzu waved her down and told her that her husband's symptoms had only gotten worse. She begged Sister Adela to please come home with her and see Mabalo. Sister Adela seemed alarmed that Mabalo was still sick, and so she agreed to go. Sister Adela told her mother superior that she'd be back in an hour. When the two women reached Mabalo's bedside, Mbuzu gasped. Her husband wasn't moving, and there was blood oozing from his eyes and ears. Mbuzu screamed and rushed to her husband. Mabalo opened his mouth like he was going to speak. Mbuzu leaned closer to hear whatever he was going to say, but then jumped back as a small river of blood gushed out of his mouth, trailing down his chin and staining their bedsheets. Horrified, Mbuzu turned to Sister Adela, who stared in disbelief. Then Mbuzu heard Mabalo begin to throw up, and so she grabbed a bucket just as he vomited up bile and blood. Mbuzu kept telling her husband that he'd be okay, but Sister Adela quietly shook her head. Mbuzu could tell by the nun's shell-shocked expression that she clearly had no idea what to do. Sister Adela just said she'd give him another injection of quinine, even though the last shot had done no good at all. After giving him the quinine injection, Sister Adela stayed a bit longer, helping Mbuzu clean up the blood dripping from her husband's eyes and ears. Once he was all cleaned up, Sister Adela told the couple that she promised to check in the next morning. But as she left, Mbuzu began to worry that tomorrow might be too late. A few days later, on September 7th, 1976, Mbuzu held her husband's hand as he took sharp, labored breaths. Sister Adela's quinine injections had not done anything. Mabalo was still unbelievably sick, his eyes had not stopped bleeding, and his saliva was red with blood. Mbuzu could hear blood gurgle in her husband's throat as he struggled to get air. She squeezed his hand helplessly until she heard her husband stop breathing. Suddenly, Mbuzu felt a terrible emptiness. Her husband was dead. She wrapped their bedsheet around Mabalo, letting her tears fall onto his motionless body. A few hours later, Mbuzu stooped over Mabalo's body alongside the women of Mabalo's family and some of Mbuzu's closest friends. Their front yard was full of neighbors and loved ones who came to sit with Mbuzu as she grieved. Despite her grief, Mbuzu felt touched by how many people mobilized to support her. Mbuzu and the other women washed Mabalo's body and wrapped him in a clean burial shroud. This was the funeral tradition in their village. Tomorrow, the men in the village would move Mabalo to the graveyard to be buried. A few days later, on the morning after Mabalo's funeral, Mbuzu awoke feeling totally exhausted. She'd barely eaten since her husband died, and she was completely worn out from crying. The moment she sat up, her head began to throb. She rubbed her temples trying to ease the pain, and then, without warning, she felt vomit surge in her throat. She barely had time to run outside before she threw up. Mbuzu knew this had to be more than just exhaustion. She cleaned herself up and then headed for the clinic right away. Mabalo's nurse friend, Sukato, had just finished sweeping the floor when Mbuzu appeared at the doorstep that morning. She looked awful. Even though the morning was still fairly cool, Sukato could see that Mbuzu was sweating profusely. Sukato felt a shiver run up his spine as he remembered the day that Mabalo had stumbled through the clinic doorway. He'd looked just as sick as Mbuzu looked now. He told Mbuzu to sit down, and then he ran out back to grab the nuns. Sukato came back inside with Sister Adela, and together they led Mbuzu to a bed. Sukato gave Mbuzu an encouraging smile, even though he feared she'd caught the same disease as Mabalo, which obviously killed Mabalo. And when his eyes met Mbuzu's, he could tell she was fearing the same thing. A few days later, in mid-September, Sukato was at work, busy refilling syringes with quinine, the malaria medicine. Behind him, Mbuzu's mother, sister, and daughter were all lying in clinic beds alongside Mbuzu. All of them were suffering from the same high fever and persistent headache. Mbuzu's mother had started hallucinating, especially at night. Sometimes when she was sleepy and her fever was spiking, she'd say that her dead son-in-law was standing in the clinic. Other times, she would see shadows that were not there. Sukato felt certain that these women did not have malaria. For one thing, malaria is not contagious, so it made no sense that 4 women from the same family had gotten sick one after another. Then there was the way that Sister Adela had described Mabalo bleeding from his eyes, ears, and mouth before dying. Sakato had never seen malaria cause something like that. To Sakato, it seemed like this bleeding sickness was something new and that it was somehow spreading among families. Mbuzu and her relatives had not started bleeding yet, but if their illness progressed anything like Mabalo's had, it wouldn't be long until they did. The thought of an entire room full of patients all bleeding from their eyes horrified Sakato, and if their disease really was contagious, then he could be lying in bed among them by tomorrow bleeding out of his eyes. But then he looked across the room to a perfectly healthy pregnant woman who was resting in bed with an IV in her arm. She had come in for a routine checkup and prenatal vitamins. For this woman and everyone else in Yambuku, the little clinic was the only healthcare they had. It was literally the difference between life and death for countless villagers. Sakato knew that whatever the risk, he had to keep coming back to work. People were counting on him. Full of renewed purpose, Sakato finished filling the syringes of quinine and went to help his patients. A week later, just before sunrise, Sakato stood outside the clinic door with a growing sense of dread. More and more villagers were getting sick, all with the same horrible symptoms. 21 people had come to the clinic with this disease so far, and every single one of them had lingered in bed, unable to eat or drink, growing so weak that they could barely lift their heads, until finally, around the 10-day mark after getting sick, blood would start leaking from their ears and eyes. Some patients had red-stained teeth from all the blood pooling in their mouths. After that, it was only a matter of days before they died from blood loss. Almost all of the people who'd gotten sick had died. Mbuzu had lived, but she lost her entire family. At this point, only 4 patients remained alive in the clinic. And the outbreak was far from over. 2 days ago, one of the pregnant women who came for prenatal vitamins began bleeding. Sakato had tended to her himself, knowing that if the mother died, her baby would too. The stress was really weighing on him. Even from the clinic doorstep, he could already smell the sweat and sickness of the patients inside. But as scared as Sakato was about getting sick himself, he was not going to stop helping. He pulled his protective mask from his pocket and wrapped it around his face. Then he unlocked the front door and stepped inside. As quietly as possible, Sakato moved down the row of beds, and by the far wall, the pregnant woman was lying on her side beneath the blanket. Sakato held his breath as he approached her, hoping she was still alive. But as he rounded her bed and crouched down, he could tell that she was not breathing. Sakato wanted to get a wet rag to clean her up a bit, but he knew that duty belonged to her family. So he just pulled the bedsheet up over her head and said a little prayer for everyone who remained in Yambuku. One morning a few days later, so in late September, Sakato sat by Sister Adela's bedside. The brave nun who had treated so many patients with the bleeding sickness now had the disease herself. And sadly, she was far from alone. 17 nuns lived at the mission, and 11 of them had fallen ill with this sickness. Sakato and Sister Adela had cared for them together, in addition to the patients still lying in the clinic across the courtyard. One by one, each of the 11 nuns had died except for Adela, who was barely clinging to life. The Mother Superior had been forced to close the clinic altogether, leaving this ravaged village with no one left to care for the sick and dying. Sakato's sick neighbors had started leaving Yambuku, searching for help in nearby villages. Nobody had returned alive. But it was no better in Yambuku. Sakato did the math and realized that so far, 90% of the people treated at their clinic for this bleeding sickness had died. Sakato pressed an aspirin into Sister Adela's shaky hand and then handed her a cup of water. The clinic had treated so many patients over the last month that they were down to their last aspirin, and this was it. Sister Adela thanked him with a hoarse voice, and he told her to please get some rest. Sakato left her room and walked down the long cement hallway that ran through the nuns' living quarters. For years, this had always been a very busy and bustling corridor, but now it was a ghost town. Sakato walked past empty room after empty room where the nuns used to live before the bleeding sickness had killed them. As Sakato neared the kitchen, he heard the crackle of static filtering in from the supply closet where the nuns kept their two-way radio. He peeked inside and found the Mother Superior turning dials as she tried to reach the outside world. She looked up at Sakado, and he was taken aback by the weariness in her face. She told him that all morning she'd been calling for help. She'd sent out radio signal after radio signal, hoping someone might hear and get word to the Red Cross or the Zairean government that they desperately needed help, but so far nobody had responded. Sakato felt a wave of dread wash over him as he listened to the Mother Superior's grim news. Over the past 6 weeks, they'd received no news from the outside world and no additional medical supplies. And now Sakato wondered how far the disease had really spread. Had it gone all the way across Africa? Was it all over the world? Was there anybody still left out there? Sakato needed fresh air. He stumbled out of the kitchen into the backyard behind the mission complex. Nearer to the tree line, there was a row of 11 white crosses marking the dead nuns' graves. Sakato had helped dig those graves. He imagined Sister Adela lying there on the edge of the jungle beneath her white cross, and now he wondered who would dig his grave when he eventually caught this sickness and died too. And then, almost like clockwork, a wave of nausea overtook him. Sakato hunched over and vomited on the ground, and when he looked down, his vomit was full of bile and blood. He had finally caught the bleeding sickness. About a week later, on the last day of September, Sakato was laying in bed staring at the ceiling. Because the clinic was shut down, he had just quarantined himself at home. Sakato had not left his bed for days, and he felt incredibly weak, but so far, he had not begun bleeding from the eyes or ears. He was determined to stay alive through sheer willpower. Just then, the ground beneath him began to shake, making the glass on his bedside table rattle. Sakato hoisted himself up onto his forearms to look out the window. He could see military vehicles making their way down the long dirt road that led into Yambuku. As Sakato watched in astonishment, the vehicles fanned out and surrounded his corner of the village. The soldier then spoke into the bullhorn and announced that Yambuku was now under quarantine. Nobody was leaving or coming back. Sakato was too weak, so he laid back down on his bed and just listened to the sound of the booming voice that was filling the air. The soldier continued and said that people in 50 surrounding villages were now also experiencing the bleeding sickness. Even people in the capital city of Kinshasa, 700 miles away, were showing symptoms. But the soldier said that the whole outbreak began right here in Yambuku. Sakato closed his eyes as the horror of their situation sank in. The disease was clearly spreading fast, and it was also clear that the government had no idea how to stop it. The people of Zaire needed help from the outside, but he couldn't imagine anyone would be brave enough to come to Zaire to fight this lethal sickness. A week later, a 27-year-old Belgian scientist named Peter Piot felt a rush of anticipation as he stepped off a plane onto an airstrip located 75 miles from Yambuku. It was a little more than a month after the first victim of the bleeding disease, Mabalo Loella, had died. Peter was part of an international team of scientists and doctors sent to try to stop the disease before it spread beyond Zaire. Peter looked around the airstrip, taking in the lush green rainforest that hummed with plant and animal life. To him, it was the most beautiful landscape he'd ever seen. It was totally unlike anything in his native Belgium. Peter turned to help his teammates, who were all collecting their luggage from the belly of their little plane. Peter had to admit that he was not nearly as qualified for this assignment to go stop this disease as his teammates were. Peter had only recently graduated from medical school. However, he'd crammed in as much research as possible before he left Belgium. He learned about using protective equipment, taking samples in the field, and how to take and test blood samples. A few days earlier, the American Centers for Disease Control, or CDC for short, had confirmed that the bleeding disease plaguing Zaire was caused by a virus no one had ever seen before. Nobody knew where this virus came from or how to treat it, but they did know where they needed to start the investigation. Nearly 1/4 of the 300 or so cases across the entire country were reported in Yambuku. So Peter and his more experienced teammates knew that their journey would start right there. Peter was last to collect his bags from inside the plane. He told the pilot they were good to go, and the pilot shouted adieu as the plane took off. It occurred to Peter right away that in this part of Africa, people didn't really say adieu, they would say au revoir to say goodbye, which was French for see you again. But the pilot had just said adieu, which simply meant goodbye, as though he did not expect to see Peter or his colleagues ever again. Peter swallowed hard. There was no going back now. So he hoisted his bag up onto his shoulder and then followed the rest of his team off the airstrip toward a line of waiting Land Rovers. 4 hours later, from the backseat of a Land Rover, Peter saw a group of small wooden houses with thatched roofs in the distance. He knew that it had to be Yambuku. As they reached the center of the village, the Land Rover stopped. It took a moment for Peter to see why the drivers had pulled over. The road into the clinic compound was blocked. Hospital gauze was draped across the entrance to warn people to stay away. On a tree nearby, a sign had been nailed up. It read, quote, "Please stop. Anyone who crosses here may die," end quote. Peter could feel the mood in the Land Rover shift, as though the gravity of this situation was now truly sinking in. But nobody said a word, so Peter decided to take charge. He jumped out of the Land Rover, stepped over the gauze barricade, and began walking toward the clinic. As he approached, 3 nuns came rushing out, yelling at him to stop. But Peter kind of held up a hand, and he told the first nun that came up to him that they were doctors, and they were here to help figure out what was causing the bleeding sickness. Peter was touched by the look of utter relief on the nun's face. She said her name was Sister Marcella. She told Peter that for the past 2 weeks, the clinic had just been closed, and the remaining living nuns were simply praying for an end to this horror. She said that she and the others would do whatever she could to assist them, and motioned for Peter and the others to follow her inside the clinic. Peter carried his bag through the empty clinic and out into the courtyard. As the rest of the team got busy setting up a work camp, Peter asked Sister Marcella if they had any records of the patients who'd gotten sick from this disease and died. She nodded and promised to give him all her notes on the 70 victims from Yambuku, 63 of whom were now dead. Peter could hardly contain his shock. He'd known the disease was bad, but hearing the death toll out loud was staggering. 2 hours later, as the nuns cooked dinner, Peter and his team huddled around a table in the courtyard. Peter listened as the lead doctor explained their mission. The next morning, they would head out into the countryside looking for victims. They needed to talk to sick people and their families about when and where they got the disease, and then collect their blood for analysis. Peter was hoping that after a few days of interviews and testing samples, they could get an idea of how this disease was spreading. He felt energized again as he got up from the table and helped the nuns carry dinner out to his team. The next morning, Peter and 3 teammates drove west along a red dirt road on their way to visit nearby villages. Peter was struck again by how lush and green everything was. He loved listening to the sounds of insects and birds humming in the growing heat. It was easy to forget why he was there. But a reminder came soon enough when their Land Rover encountered a big pile of logs blocking the road about an hour west of Yambuku. The nuns had actually warned them about this. Most of these surrounding villages had blocked off their roads to keep out the people who had this bleeding sickness. The villagers had no supplies left to give out, and they obviously did not want to catch the sickness themselves. Peter wanted to respect their wishes, but it was vital for them to see what was going on in these other villages. So Peter and the rest of his team dragged the logs to the side of the road, then jumped back into the car and continued their journey. As the Land Rover made its way into the center of this village, people came out to see what was going on. Peter had expected the villagers to avoid them out of fear, so he was surprised when a few of the villagers gathered right around their car, looking very curious. The driver parked the car, and everybody piled out while the team leader went to speak with the village elders. Peter took a little piece of candy out of his pocket and handed it to one of the little boys who'd come to investigate. He noticed that none of the kids playing around the village seemed sick. He wondered if maybe the roadblock had worked. Perhaps it stopped the disease from reaching this village. Maybe there would be no blood samples to collect here, or survivors to talk to. That would be good news for the village, but a waste of a trip for Peter and his team. But then the team leader waved Peter over. He said one of the villagers had something to show them. So Peter grabbed his backpack from the Land Rover, and they followed this villager toward a nearby mud and clay home with a banana leaf roof. At the doorway, they all put on protective equipment, which included motorcycle goggles, gloves, paper face masks, and long sanitary gowns. Then they followed the villager into the modest home. It was cooler inside, but Peter's protective equipment still felt sweltering in the midday heat. Toward the back, Peter saw a husband and wife laying on a raffia mat on the floor. As Peter neared them, he could see they were so weak they could barely move. Dried blood coated their ears and their cheeks from where it had streamed out of their eyes. To Peter, it was like something out of a zombie film, and for a moment, he just froze. But then he remembered where he was and what he had to do. Peter took a syringe out of his backpack and knelt down next to the woman. He gently stuck the needle into her arm and filled a vial with her blood. The team leader knelt down on the other side of the raffia mat to take a sample from the man. Peter stood up and walked over to his backpack and pulled a little pouch from inside. He wrapped the vials of blood in plastic and stuck them into a baggie before putting the bag and the syringe into his backpack. And right as he did that, Peter turned around because his team leader gasped. It took Peter a moment to realize what had happened. The sick man on the floor had just died. Peter just stood there for a moment, totally frozen in surprise. Then he looked over at the dead man's wife, who looked like she didn't have long to live either. To Peter, it felt callous to leave her, and yet there was nothing they could do. They had no idea how to treat this new disease. In fact, the only way they could help was just to keep on moving. The villager who had led them into this hut ushered Peter and his team leader out of the home. As he walked them back to their car, the villager explained that soon that entire home would be full of women washing the man's body and preparing it for burial. It would be disrespectful for Peter and his teammate to be there anyway. So Peter, feeling relieved, thanked the man as he hopped into the Land Rover, and then they drove off to the next village. On the evening of the third day, Peter and his crew sat around their table in the clinic courtyard and compared notes. One thing they'd been noticing was that in many villages, more women seemed to get sick than men. And in Yambuku, a lot of pregnant women seemed to contract the sickness. But that wasn't enough information to actually draw any conclusions just yet. Strangely, the researchers had found that the village with the fewest bleeding sickness cases actually had no medical care at all. The village had only a traditional healer who handed out herbs and did healing rituals, but had almost no knowledge of modern medicine. And yet, his village was the only one they visited where nobody had died. The next day, Peter and his team leader went to that village where nobody had died yet to investigate further. When they arrived, the villagers brought them to their healer. As the team leader interviewed the healer, it occurred to Peter that the healer's home smelled strongly of bleach. He only noticed it because since landing in Zaire, he'd mostly smelled firewood, generator oil, and the jungle. So this chemical smell really stood out. Peter asked the healer why he was using so much bleach, and the healer just raised an eyebrow as though Peter had just asked him a totally ridiculous question. The healer pointed at a bunch of gadgets lying on top of a small table. Most were made of metal, and they looked like medical equipment, while others appeared to be homemade. The healer told Peter that those were his instruments, and he would use bleach and chlorine to sanitize them between clients. Once he said it, Peter almost felt dumb because the answer was so obvious. In the West, doctors used disinfectants to sterilize medical instruments, but in a place like this that was more remote, bleach was a decent substitute. Peter made a note of this in his journal. That evening, when they arrived back at the clinic in Yambuku, Peter followed Sister Marcella through the clinic, watching as she tidied up the space. He knew that she had seen this disease much more than they had, and so maybe she knew something that he and his team had not thought to ask about. Peter told her about the village with the local healer where nobody had died from the bleeding sickness. Sister Marcella said she actually was not surprised at all. She said the number of cases in Yambuku did not really start to rise quickly until the first patient, the school headmaster, had died. Peter stopped walking. The comment kind of struck him as odd. He asked Sister Marcella to explain what she meant. She turned and told Peter that, so far, the cases they'd seen had come in bursts. Every time there was a funeral, like clockwork, the next several cases of the bleeding sickness they would see would be people who had attended that funeral. It was like one big chain reaction. Peter thanked Marcella for the tour, and as he headed outside, his mind was racing. He and his teammates knew that this disease spread most easily to people closest to the sick, but they had not given much thought to the funerals themselves. Could it be that funerals were a breeding ground for this sickness? Marcella had said that it was usually close friends and family of the dead who got sick next, not all the other kind of random mourners who came to the funerals. So it wasn't just that funerals brought large groups of people close together. There had to be something about Zairean funerals that encouraged the spread amongst close family. Peter went to share this information with his team, determined to figure out what the cause might be. A few hours later, Peter sat around the courtyard table with his team, studying all the information they had collected from villages throughout the region. In every village they'd visited, the bleeding sickness had appeared in bursts, mostly affecting close friends and family of the deceased. And they noticed far more women were contracting the disease than men. Then there was another piece of information. In Yambuku, many pregnant women who visited the clinic later got sick. These pregnant women were just about the only ones to get the disease who had not recently been at a funeral for a close family member. Now, Peter and his team knew two things for certain. Something about these funerals was making people sick, and there was something unique about Yambuku that was giving the disease to pregnant women. Peter and his teammates talked into the night, but they just couldn't figure out what the connection was. It was like the explanation was staring them right in the face, but they just could not connect the dots. Peter rubbed his eyes, fighting off sleep. He did not want to give up and go to bed yet. So he stood and offered to make some coffee, and everyone agreed. Nobody was ready to call it a night. A few minutes later, Peter rummaged through the small kitchen in the nuns' living quarters, looking for the coffee. Then he heard footsteps behind him and turned to see the clinic's nurse, Sakato, carrying a tray of food. Peter had met Sakato several times and really liked him. Peter also knew that Sakato was one of the very lucky 10% of people to survive the bleeding sickness. So, to Peter, Sakato was like a walking miracle. Sakato also seemed to know just about everything, and he was always so eager to help. Peter asked Sakato if he wouldn't mind helping him find the coffee. Sakato smiled knowingly and then reached into one of the tall cabinets and pulled out a glass jar. That's when Peter had a thought. He asked Sakato to walk him through the procedure for when pregnant women came to the clinic for prenatal care. Sakato could do it in his sleep. He'd seen the nurses do it 1,000 times. He motioned for Peter to follow him into the clinic. There, Peter watched as Sakato walked to the counter in the back of the clinic and opened up one of the drawers. He withdrew 5 syringes and then told Peter that these were the 5 needles that they used to treat their patients: vitamin shots for expecting mothers and quinine shots for malaria patients. Sakato said they cleaned these needles every evening to keep them in good working order. As Sakato put the needles back in their drawer, Peter realized what Sakato had just said, that they were only cleaning the needles once a day. He blinked, trying not to seem too alarmed. He clarified with Sakato that the clinic used the same needles between pregnant women and bleeding sickness patients, and Sakato said yes, especially in the beginning when the nuns thought everybody just had malaria. Peter was dumbfounded. That meant healthy pregnant women who had come to the clinic to get a vitamin shot were likely being injected with tiny droplets of blood from people who had the bleeding sickness. No wonder so many pregnant women and their babies were dying in Yambuku. They were being directly injected with the disease by their nurses. The thought of it made Peter sick. Peter remembered the healer whose home smelled like bleach. He had been actually sterilizing his instruments between patients, and so that was why the bleeding sickness had not spread in his village. Now the wheels in Peter's brain were really turning. He thought back to the man who died right as they took his blood sample during the first week in Zaire. The villager who'd taken them there had said the women in the dead man's family had to wash his body for burial right away. And right then, Peter's eyes went wide as he had this sudden realization. He thanked Sakato and hurried right back out to the courtyard where his teammates were working, because he had a vital piece of information he needed to share with them. Peter and his team soon realized that the bleeding sickness was spread through contact with bodily fluids. In Zaire, part of the funeral custom was for the women in the family to wash the body of the deceased immediately after death. The virus was still very much alive on the dead body and spread when loved ones came into contact with bodily fluids such as blood. Meanwhile, the pregnant women in Yambuku were getting this disease from contaminated blood on the syringes used for their vitamin shots. As Peter and his team researched the disease further, they soon discovered that this lethal virus was originally confined to animals like chimpanzees and fruit bats. Mabalo Loella, the school headmaster in Yambuku, and patient zero likely ate infected game on his hunting trip and became the first human victim. His wife Mbuzu and her family then caught the virus while preparing his body for burial. By the time Peter and his team learned how the bleeding sickness spread, nearly 300 people across Zaire and neighboring southern Sudan had died. But the spread was stopped thanks to the villagers' self-imposed quarantine and medical information being shared widely about the danger of sharing needles and touching bodily fluids. Peter and his teammates were tapped with naming this disease, and they decided to call it the Ebola Virus after a river in the area. They thought about naming it Yambuku, but they didn't want to stigmatize the village. Since 1976, there have been more than 38 outbreaks of Ebola and over 15,000 deaths. Now, there is a vaccine for a particular strain of the Ebola virus, but as of today, there is still no cure. On the morning of Saturday, November 18th, 1961, a 23-year-old man named Michael Rockefeller reached down and grabbed the pull cord that was connected to the outboard motor that was on the boat that Michael was riding in. And Michael, he pulled and pulled on that cord, but he could not get this engine to restart. It just sputtered and wouldn't turn over. And without power, that meant that Michael and his small crew just continued to drift farther and farther out to sea. But that wasn't even the worst of this situation. The boat that Michael and his crew were on, which was a 40-foot-long catamaran, it was two handcrafted canoes tied together, well, it was starting to sink. Minutes before, Michael and his crew had been happily traveling along the beautiful green jungled coast of New Guinea when they had to cross over this area where the water was particularly turbulent. There was this river in New Guinea that was feeding out to the Arafura Sea, which is where Michael and his crew were, and where this brown river met the blue water, it became very choppy with lots of rough waves. And so as Michael and his crew tried to cross that area, the waves came on board, they flooded the engine, it shut off, and then as more and more waves landed inside the boat began to sink. The reason why Michael and his crew were even out here and taking these chances to begin with is because Michael wanted to go see this tribe called the Asmats that lived in New Guinea, basically right past this area where this river was. They lived right on the coast. Michael was obsessed with the artwork that the Asmat tribe created, in particular, the very unique bis pole. These poles are created by the master carvers within the Asmat tribe. What they do is they take a single piece of wood and they etch it away until it looks like it's a bunch of men standing on each other's shoulders. Now, these bis poles are totally beautiful and intricate and wonderful to look at, but the Asmat tribe doesn't make them for art. They make them because they believe they contain the souls of the warriors from their tribe who have been killed in combat. And until the Asmats avenge these downed warriors, basically until the tribe kills their enemies, these souls remain trapped in these bis poles, which means the Asmats don't really ever get rid of these poles. They don't sell them. They don't throw them away. They are just part of their culture and society. But months ago, Michael had come and visited the Asmat tribe. He had learned about these bis poles and what they meant, and he believed he had successfully negotiated a deal where he would barter some of his own goods in order to get one of their bis poles. But even though Michael gave them all the things he had offered, they had not in return sent the bis pole. And so now Michael was coming back to hopefully be able to claim the bis pole and take it with him. But as Michael sat in his sinking catamaran, watching the muddy shores of New Guinea get farther and farther away as he drifted farther and farther out into the Arafura Sea, The last thing on his mind was the bis pole. He needed to figure out what they were going to do. Michael's crew consisted of 3 other people. There was a French anthropologist named Rene, and there were 2 teenagers who were actually Asmat guides, and their names were Simon and Leo. And so after Michael was unable to start the engine up, all 3 of them took their turn yanking on the cord, but they too could not get it to start. Finally, Simon and Leo spoke up, and they said to Michael and Rene that at this point they believed their only hope was abandoning the catamaran, jumping into the ocean, and swimming to shore, which for now was about a half-mile away, but they were drifting so quickly out to sea that if they waited any longer, they might be too far away to actually make that swim. But Rene was not a good swimmer at all, and Michael was just not ready to totally abandon ship and leave this thing out here to sink, because on board the catamaran was all this stuff he had brought along, like tobacco and fishing line and clothes and candy and all this different stuff that he knew this tribe wouldn't have, and he could use it as leverage to continue bartering to get his bis pole and to get other artwork they might be offering. And so even though Michael understood that obviously this catamaran and everything on it is going to sink into the ocean at some point, he just wasn't there mentally to jump off now and just kind of abandon all this stuff. And so a decision was made that the 2 Asmat guides, the 2 teenagers, Simon and Leo, they on their own would jump out, swim to shore, and try to get help, while Michael and Rene stayed back and waited for that help to come. And so a few moments later, the 2 teenagers jumped into the water and began their long swim to shore. And as they did, Michael watched, and it suddenly dawned on him just how far away he was from his own home. It had been months since Michael had last showered, so he smelled terrible. He was totally sunburned and caked in dirt, and his hands were rough and calloused from all the rowing he was doing. But this was not really Michael's real life, because Michael was not from New Guinea or from anywhere near here. He was actually from America, where his family was one of the most well-known, influential, and richest families ever. Like in the history of humanity, the Rockefeller family are in like the top 10 of the most powerful people ever. Michael's grandfather was the oil tycoon John D. Rockefeller, who at the time was literally the richest man in the world, and Michael's father, Nelson Rockefeller, was at the time the governor of New York and the future vice president of the United States. But despite having these unbelievable resources at his disposal, Michael was not compelled to kind of be a Rockefeller. Instead, he found his calling in the wilds of New Guinea. He had first come here 7 months earlier with a team of Harvard University filmmakers who were looking to document a very remote tribe. And Michael just fell in love with the adventure of this trip, even though on this trip, while they were filming a battle between this remote tribe and another tribe, Michael got shot accidentally in the shoulder with an arrow. So despite being wounded effectively in combat, Michael just loved being in New Guinea. In fact, Michael actually never told his family about getting shot in the shoulder with this arrow because he was worried if he told his family, the all-powerful Rockefeller family, they would respond by seeking out retribution against one of these tribes that had inadvertently harmed Michael Rockefeller. And so Michael was just very respectful and protective of the people he came in contact with in New Guinea, and in many ways he viewed them as more like his people than his family. And so after the Harvard University filmmakers wrapped up their documentary and went back to America, Michael had stayed in New Guinea. And in the meantime, his father, Nelson Rockefeller, had opened up a museum back home in New York called the Museum of Primitive Art, and what it displayed was artwork from places like New Guinea. Now, this was the early 1960s, and so many Westerners viewed natives of New Guinea, like the people of the Asmat tribe, as being very primitive and backwards. And so as a result, there was a lot of people that were drawn to this new museum in New York just for the spectacle of it, to see what these primitive backwards people were creating. But Michael felt like he had a deeper understanding of the natives of New Guinea, and he felt like it was his responsibility to go out and find the incredible artwork all around New Guinea, including like the bis poles from the Asmat tribe, and send that artwork back to his father to be put up in this museum so that it was more than just a spectacle. Michael wanted the people of the West to appreciate and respect the natives of New Guinea the same way he did, and he believed through art he could do that. And so Michael had teamed up with Rene, the French anthropologist, to go all around New Guinea to find this artwork to send back to his dad. A few hours after Simon and Leo had leapt off the sinking catamaran and began their swim to shore, Michael and Rene had no idea if they'd even made it to shore. They hadn't seen anybody show up to rescue them, and so as far as they knew, they had no idea how close they were to being rescued or not. And as they looked down, they saw their catamaran was sinking lower and lower in the water. And so at some point, Michael and Rene just grabbed buckets and began bailing the water out of the catamaran, which was totally useless. The water was coming in way too quickly, but they had nothing else to do, and so they're bailing the water out, and then a rogue wave comes through and flips the entire catamaran over, sending Michael and Rene into the sea. And so luckily, Michael and Rene were able to swim to the surface. They swam over to the now upturned catamaran, but there was an air pocket kind of trapped underneath it, and so it was staying afloat. And so Michael and Rene grabbed onto the catamaran, and Michael actually grabbed a gas canister that had come off the boat, and he attached it to his belt like a flotation device. And so he and Rene just kind of held on to this upturned catamaran. Michael was also supported by this gas canister, and they just continued to wait, hoping that Simon and Leo had made it to shore and that help would be arriving soon. But in the back of Michael's mind, he knew that if help didn't come soon, Michael might have to do something drastic, like attempt the swim himself, which now was way farther than half a mile away. By the next morning, when the sun came up, Michael and Rene were still in the water, holding on to that catamaran, waiting for help to arrive, but no help had come. Now, Michael was a very good swimmer, but by this point, he knew they were at least 5 or maybe even 10 miles from shore. So this would be a gargantuan swim in pretty rough waters. But, Michael, he's a Rockefeller. He had a lot of confidence, and he began telling Rene that, hey, I'm going to do this swim. I know I can do it. I can swim the whole distance. Even if it's 10 miles, I can do it. You're going to have to just hang tight. It's going to take a while, but I'll get us help. Rene begged Michael not to go, but Michael said, I have to do something, otherwise we're gonna die out here. And so all Rene could do was watch as Michael stripped off some of his clothes and attached another gas canister to his belt to give him a little bit more flotation. And then Michael shook Rene's hand, and then right around 8 a.m. on Sunday, November 19th, 1961, Michael began the swim. About 12 hours later, so that night, while Rene is still just holding onto this catamaran, hoping help is going to come soon, suddenly, kind of without warning, the sky suddenly erupted with this incredibly bright flame. And what it was a plane flying overhead that had spotted Rene and the upturned catamaran. They had fired a flare into the air to be like, hey, we see you, we're going to send help. And then just a couple of hours later, a boat came around and picked Rene up. And when Rene climbed on board, he was so relieved, and he asked the captain, hey, did Michael Rockefeller tell you I was out here? Is that why you knew I was here? And the captain said, no, we were told by 2 teenagers, 2 guides, Simon and Leo, that you were out here. No one's heard from Michael. Now, you need to remember that Michael Rockefeller was a Rockefeller. And so as soon as Rene heard, oh my goodness, we don't know where Michael is, and he told the captain that Michael had begun this unbelievably long swim to shore to get help, it was like suddenly a bomb had gone off in the Rockefeller family, and they committed all of their money and their resources and their influence to launch the biggest manhunt basically ever to find Michael. They dispatched ships and helicopters and planes. They got in touch with the US Navy and got them to be fully involved. I mean, they looked everywhere for weeks, but they could not find Michael. This search for Michael would continue for years. Now, it wouldn't be as intense as the first few weeks, but there was always somebody or some entity looking for Michael around the area where he had begun that swim. But by 1964, so 3 years after Michael had begun the swim to shore, the Rockefeller family finally accepted that Michael had to be dead, that he had to have drowned on that 5 or 10 mile swim to shore. For the last 60 years, I've been a hardcore whale mail enthusiast. Every morning I wake up and I break out my quill and parchment, and I draft up the various messages I need to send to my team. And then after slapping those in my backpack, I dive into the ocean, and I swim out until I encounter a whale, and then I jump on its back and I spend 45 minutes wrestling with it until I've secured my packages to its hefty trunk, and then I leap off that beast, wish it good luck, swim to shore, and wait for my mail to get delivered. But despite how glorious this shipping system sounds, unfortunately, in the past 6 decades, not one whale has understood it was my courier, and so as a result, all of my mail has gone undelivered. So, after 60 years, I finally decided to give up on whale mail and join the future and entrust all of my shipping needs to Stamps.com. For 25 years, Stamps.com has been helping businesses save time and money. With Stamps.com, all you need is a computer and a printer. They even send you a free scale, so you'll have everything you need to get started. Stamps.com automatically tells you your cheapest and fastest shipping options. Also, you get access to all the USPS and UPS services that you need right from your computer anytime, day or night, no lines, no traffic, no waiting. So even though I know whale mail has a place in all of our hearts, it's time to free Willy and join Stamps.com. Set your business up for success when you get started with Stamps.com today. Sign up at Stamps.com/MrBallen for a special offer that includes a 4-week trial, plus free postage, and a free digital scale. No long-term commitments or contracts. Just go to Stamps.com/MrBallen. And when the family finally kind of accepted that that is what happened, that became the story in America about what happened to Michael Rockefeller. In fact, his sister even wrote a best-selling book about grieving his loss. But in New Guinea, a very different story began to spread about what happened to Michael. Rumors about his fate were whispered along trade routes and between visiting missionaries and gossiped about in tabloid and adventure magazines. In 1969, so 5 years after Michael was declared dead by his family, an adventure magazine reporter named Milt Macklin heard from this mysterious Australian person who was a source for this magazine that they had actually run into Michael Rockefeller recently in the jungle of New Guinea, not far from where he supposedly disappeared. And Milt would actually follow up on this tip, despite how not credible it was, and he would go to New Guinea with a film crew, and he would go to this area, and he would look everywhere for Michael, he would talk to locals. I mean, he really scoured the area, but there was no sign of Michael. And so Milt, feeling very let down by this, he came back home and he actually wrote a best-selling book about his quest to find Michael Rockefeller. But crucially, even though he had shot all this footage, both at a distance and up close, of all these tribes in the area where Michael supposedly was, he and his team never really reviewed the footage. They basically shot all this footage while they were there looking for Michael, couldn't find him, and said, meh, and put the footage aside. But 40 years later, another documentary film crew decided they were going to go to New Guinea and look for Michael, because there were still all these rumors floating around that Michael was alive and living in the jungles of New Guinea. And before they actually went to New Guinea to go looking for Michael, they uncovered this unwatched footage from Milt Macklin, and they watched all of it, and they discovered something unbelievable. Amongst the hours and hours of footage, there is this brief shot taken from a distance where the film crew is shooting on land out towards the water, and you see this canoe come into frame, and it's full of Asmat tribe warriors. This is a war party, and they're making their way presumably into battle with some other tribe. But amongst these big, strong men is one man who totally stands out because he doesn't look like the other Asmat warriors. He is a naked, bearded white man who, again, even though the quality of the film was poor, he totally looked like Michael Rockefeller. And so as soon as word got out about this footage, very quickly rumors began to spread all around the world about how this heir to a billionaire's fortune had decided to turn away from his family and just live amongst the Asmat tribe as one of theirs. Now, again, we have no idea if that really was Michael Rockefeller. It could easily have been, a missionary or some other white person that happened to be in New Guinea, but the story was incredible, and so it spread everywhere. In 2012, so 4 years after this unwatched Milt Macklin footage came to light, and over 50 years since Michael Rockefeller actually went missing, a National Geographic journalist named Carl Hoffman, who had grown up totally fascinated by the mystery surrounding Michael Rockefeller, he decided that he would go to New Guinea and finally get to the bottom of what happened to Michael Rockefeller. And after Carl and his interpreter went to New Guinea and lived with the Asmat tribe for months and gained their trust and gained their respect, they began to tell him a brand new story that he had never heard before about what happened to Michael, the real story. And they gave him a dire warning that if he ever told anyone what actually happened to Michael, that the whole village would likely be killed, and maybe even he too would be killed. But Carl didn't listen. After hearing what really happened to Michael, he left New Guinea and wrote a book about it called Savage Harvest. And from his book, here is what happened to Michael Rockefeller. On the morning of November 19th, 1961, so roughly 24 hours after Michael had jumped into the water and began this 5 to 10 mile swim to shore to get help, 3 Asmat tribe elders named Finn, Ajim, and Pep sat amongst 50 other tribe members in 8 long canoes. And they weren't going anywhere. They were just kind of resting at the mouth of this river, the same river that dumped out into the Arafura Sea, which is exactly where Michael and his crew had ran into all those rough waters and overturned, causing their whole situation. And so all these tribes people are just sitting there in their canoes. Some of them are smoking loosely wrapped cigars. Others are chewing on flour made from a palm plant called sago. And they're all naked, minus a couple of bands around their knees and their elbows, and some of them had very intricate piercings in their noses and their ears, but they're all just kind of sitting there. It was a long day and they're enjoying some peace and quiet. But then suddenly, Ajim, one of the elders, noticed something making its way into the river from the sea. It was this white thing kind of slithering towards them, and immediately Ajim called out to the others to look, there's something over there. It's a white crocodile, it's a serpent, it's something. And they all look and they're watching, and slowly this white thing is moving its way closer and closer to them. And so, not wanting to be caught off guard, the entire group got ready and began paddling over to see what this thing was, because if it was a threat, they could deal with it. If it wasn't, so be it. And so as these 8 canoes converged on this white thing, some of them had their spears up ready to attack. But when they finally saw what this creature was, they realized it was not some serpent or crocodile or something. It was a white man, and he was floating on his back, and he had these weird flotation devices on, but he was not a threat. And so right away, all the tribesmen, they put down their spears, they kind of laugh, thinking that they were in danger for a second. And this white man, who was Michael Rockefeller, he rolled over and he looked up and he couldn't believe what he was seeing. He's just swam like 10 miles to get here, and he's seeing the tribe that he had come to see in the first place. They've come here to rescue him. And so, practically crying with relief, he turned around and grabbed one of their canoes. And as soon as he did, one of the elders, Pep, looked down at Michael holding onto his boat, and then Pep looked up at the other 2 elders, Finn and Ajim, and they just stared at each other, then back at Michael, then back at each other, and then they nodded in agreement. And then Pep helped Michael into the boat. Michael immediately just laid in the middle of the boat. He was so exhausted from that swim, but he was so relieved, and he just laid there while the tribe kind of got back into position. They turned their canoes around and began paddling back up the river, back inland. And as they paddled, they began this very strange chant. All 8 canoes, all 50 plus members of the tribe, all in unison began this chant. And Michael, he had studied the Asmat tribe and felt like he knew a lot about their culture, but he had never heard this particular chant before. And so he was enchanted by it, and he tried to ask them, what does this mean? But they just completely ignored Michael and just continued to paddle and chant. And so Michael just laid there listening, getting carried along to safety, when all of a sudden the chanting stopped and the canoes turned and kind of made their way into this little inlet that led to a clearing right on the shore. And so Michael noticed they were slowing down, and so he kind of barely got up and looked over the edge of the canoe to see if they were at their village. But when he looked up, he saw there was no village in sight. It was just this clearing out on the shore. And right away, Michael's like, well, I hope we're going to the village soon, because I have to find someone who can get in touch with the the authorities, who can then go and rescue Renee and hopefully find Simon and Leo as well. And so Michael began trying to ask the men in his canoe if they would help him, but there was, of course, a massive language barrier, and neither side really understood the other. And then at some point, one of the men from the Asmat tribe just began laughing at Michael. And when he did, the majority of the rest of the tribe looked over, saw what was going on, and they too began laughing at Michael. And so Michael had no idea what was going on. And then before he could do anything else, the entire tribe stopped laughing, and it was like in an instant, they were back into that rhythmic chanting as they slowly began making their way out of their canoes, making their way onto shore. And so Michael began to sense that something was wrong, and instead of getting out of the canoe with the rest of the tribe, he kind of instinctively laid back down on the canoe, almost like he was trying to get away from them. And when he did that, the tribesman who had first laughed at Michael, he stood right over Michael as he's doing this chant, and he smiled at Michael, and then he raised his spear and he drove it into Michael's side. And the second he did that, other members of the tribe raised these horns they were carrying and began blasting into their horns. And so Michael, he's screaming out in pain, but he's got no strength to defend himself. And so he kind of like rolled over onto the other side on this canoe, kind of trying to protect himself. And when he did that, the guy just lifted his spear again with a big smile on his face and drove it into Michael's other side. After the man pulled the spear out, Michael, who's in horrible pain, managed, perhaps with his adrenaline, to pull himself up and over the side of the canoe. So he kind of fell out onto the mud, and he tried to stand up to get away from them, but there was nowhere he could go. And so as he's kind of fumbling in the mud, two of the tribesmen walked up behind him, grabbed him under the arms, and they began carrying him across the clearing towards the jungle. And as they walked, that rhythmic chanting continued, and periodically Michael would hear someone blast on their horn. And so Michael was dragged across the shoreline into the jungle, and then finally to another clearing in the jungle, not anywhere near their village. And Michael was positioned in the middle of this clearing and put on his knees. And so Michael, he's kind of guarding his sides with his arms. He's incredibly weak. He's on his knees. The tribe kind of formed a circle around him, and they're continuing this chant. And then at some point, one of the tribesmen walked up to Michael, grabbed his head and pushed it forward, exposing the back of his neck. And then another tribe member walked in. And again, the whole time, this chanting is going on. Horns are being blown. And this other tribesman comes up and he raises an axe and he brings it down on the back of Michael's neck. It would turn out the Asmat tribe knew who Michael was. They remembered him from his visit several months earlier when he had attempted to barter for their bis poles. And they had been totally offended that this rich white man had shown up and thought he could just buy one of their sacred artifacts like it was some trinket to be put on display in a museum. And so they had held on to a deep hatred for him. That was why they didn't send their bis pole to him. They weren't going to give it to him. But when Michael had kind of magically floated into their river, and suddenly the Asmat tribe has him sitting in their canoe, the three village elders, Finn, Ajim, and Pep, they all just kind of looked at each other and nodded in agreement that they were going to ritualistically kill Michael to avenge the deaths of many of their fallen warriors that those bis poles apparently contained the souls of, because many of their warriors had been killed by white men in the past, and so Michael was going to be their way to avenge their souls. And so that chant that Michael heard them all saying, that was the chant they did when they performed this execution ritual. Except they didn't just kill Michael. After one of those tribesmen brought the axe down on the back of Michael's neck, another tribesman walked up and grabbed Michael's hair, pulled his head back, and used a knife to slash at his throat to actually remove his head. And then after his head was removed, again with all the chanting continuing in this circle the whole time, members of the tribe came up and began cutting Michael's body absolutely to pieces, separating his organs and his flesh and his bones into different piles, and then very quickly they got a fire going and cooked and ate Michael. And of all the parts of his body that were eaten, his brain was apparently the most important, and so only Finn, Ajim, and Pep, the three elders, were allowed to eat the brain. And then finally, after they had finished eating and took all the remaining meat that had not been consumed, and they put it into their pouches to eat later, Finn, one of the elders, took Michael's skull, and he would bring it back to the village, and he would cover it in banana leaves, and he would paint it, and treat it like a trophy. A few days later, when that huge search party came through the area looking for Michael, the Asmat tribe knew they could never whisper a word about what happened to Michael, because if it got out, it's very likely that Westerners would want to retaliate against them. And so for decades and decades, their secret stayed safe until Carl Hoffman of the National Geographic heard the story and then wrote the book about it, Savage Harvest. But despite publishing this book and lots of people reading it, there was always some question about the credibility of the story, because remember, there's all this intrigue and mystery around Michael's story to begin with, and now we have this account coming from the Asmat tribe, and so no one really knew how legitimate it was. And so to this day, the Rockefeller family, and generally speaking, authorities at large, still say that Michael Rockefeller drowned on his swim to shore trying to get help, and that's it. The weather on Halloween evening in Napa, California was perfect. The sky was clear and the air was cool without being cold. And all along Dorset Street, that year's most popular costumes were on display. It was October 31st, 2004, and the tree-lined neighborhood of small but pricey houses was a parade ground for pastel-colored princesses, black vampires, smiling yellow SpongeBobs, and Power Rangers in 6 different bright colors. Trailing behind and alongside these trick-or-treaters were parents who were shining their flashlights at the skull and bones and headstones planted in front yards and at the strings of orange lights around doorways. The whole scene was a snapshot of what made Napa such a desirable place to live. Located just north of San Francisco, the trendy city of 70,000 residents still had a small-town vibe. Spread out around it were miles of green hillsides, covered with the acres of grapevines that had made the Napa Valley the premier wine-producing region in the United States. And tucked inside of this agricultural wonderland, the city of Napa was both beautiful and safe. And on this particular Halloween night, if there was one house on Dorset Street that radiated that feeling of safety and warmth, it was number 2631. Barely 900 square feet in size, the olive green 1.5-story home with the white trim and the attached 2-car garage looked almost doll-sized. Hardly big enough for the 3 26-year-old women who had all moved in there together over the course of the last 9 months. 2 of those roommates, Leslie Mazzara and Adrienne Insania, had been busy all evening passing out big handfuls of candy. Their excitement about this first Halloween together in this little house could be heard loud and clear as they oohed and awed over the little visitors trooping past the effigy of a witch hanging from the outside porch ceiling to knock on the front door. The 2 roommates who greeted the trick-or-treaters, Leslie and Adrienne, and their 3rd roommate, who was sitting in the living room behind them, could not have been more different. Even before she got her degree in engineering, Adrienne had always loved building things. And in keeping with her hands-on and matter-of-fact approach to life, she had no problem telling people what was on her mind. Leslie was a former beauty queen from the Deep South who moved with the grace of someone who had spent 15 years of her life taking ballet lessons. She also had so much natural charm and magnetism that the first time she had visited one of the most famous vineyards in Napa Valley, she had immediately been offered a job. 6 months later, and Leslie had been promoted twice to her current position as a sales coordinator at the winery named after the famous Hollywood film director Francis Ford Coppola. Even the children who were there to get candy seemed immediately taken with Leslie. From her always expertly applied makeup to her long southern drawl, Leslie had stood out from the crowd from the moment she had arrived in Napa just 6 months earlier. But the children weren't just seeing Leslie's striking green eyes and friendly smile. As one of Leslie's admirers had once said, when looking for words to describe Leslie's deeper beauty, it was like trying to describe a rainbow to someone who couldn't see. In contrast to Adrienne and Leslie's outgoing personalities, the 3rd roommate at 2631 Dorset Street, 26-year-old Lauren Minza, was the quietest and the neatest of the 3 women. As the volleyball coach of the local community college, Lauren had no trouble yelling out encouragement and instruction to her students, but when it came to any sort of social confrontation, Lauren held back and usually just let Adrian do the talking. Of the three women, Lauren and Adrian had been the first to move into this rented house on Dorset Street. After graduating from California's Polytechnic State University in 2001, Adrian had returned to her childhood home in Napa Valley and almost immediately got hired in as an assistant engineer at the Napa Sanitation District. It was there, at the Sanitation District, that Adrian had met the person who would become her best friend, a contract supervisor named Lily Prudhomme. Through Lily, Adrian quickly became part of a new circle of friends. A year or so later, at the start of 2004, Adrian had met Lauren for the first time at a volleyball class they both took at Napa Community College. And in February, when Lauren found the little house on Dorset Street, she had asked Adrian to move in and share the rent. As for Lauren, her social life had taken off on the day Adrian had arrived at 2631 Dorset. In typical Adrian fashion, Lauren's new roommate did not arrive alone. Right behind Adrian, carrying cartons and furniture, were Lily and her boyfriend Eric and another friend named Ben, all of whom helped Adrian and Lauren settle into their new home. In the space of that one day, Lauren had been welcomed into Adrian and Lily's circle. And by the time all the moving boxes were empty, the whole group of them had been laughing and talking over pizza and beer. Leslie, the last roommate to arrive at 2631 Dorset Street, had walked into their lives 4 months after that pizza party. Leslie had actually been living right next door to them for several weeks, and in passing conversations, Lauren had felt an instant connection to Leslie. Lauren liked Leslie's sense of fun, and even more, Leslie's genuine warmth and interest in other people. So when Leslie's roommates made plans to move out, Lauren and Adrian invited Leslie to move in with them. Before long, the upstairs bedroom across from Adrian's was filled with Leslie's clothes, perfume, and makeup. Leslie's arrival had definitely changed the dynamic at 2631, but in a fun way. While Adrian had arrived at the little house with a tight but small circle of close friends, Leslie arrived with an army, not just friends, but acquaintances and more male admirers than she could even count. And those were just the people Leslie knew in Napa. Her phone was filled with contacts from her life in Georgia and South Carolina, including ex-boyfriends who still made regular calls to Leslie, hoping to rekindle an old romance. But despite her busy social life and being involved with at least 2 different men at the same time, inside 2631, Leslie had respected her roommate's expectation of privacy. For the most part, if any of them wanted to spend the night with a boyfriend, they did it quietly and very infrequently, or they spent the night at the man's house. But that October, Leslie had started breaking that unspoken house rule, causing the first and only real conflict among the 3 roommates. 3 nights before Halloween, on October 28th, Leslie and one of her dates had made so much noise in Leslie's bedroom that Adrian and Lauren decided it was time to call a house meeting. Lauren had dreaded what she expected would turn into an awful confrontation, something she totally hated, but with her amazing charm and tact, Leslie had managed to diffuse the situation. Before the women even sat down together, Leslie sent both Lauren and Adrian an email apologizing for putting them in such an awkward situation and costing them most of one night's sleep. The roommates' ability to resolve the situation with some simple rules about having men over, rather than arguing or fighting about it, had felt like a win for all 3 women. And by Halloween day, everything felt right again with the world. The handyman that their landlord hired was outside working on the house, and that afternoon, Lauren spent a few hours out playing soccer and running errands. Meanwhile, Leslie and Adrian, all strain forgotten, were busy in the kitchen together, making Halloween-themed cupcakes and planning the next big holidays, Thanksgiving and Christmas. By around 9 p.m. on Halloween night, nearly all the adults and trick-or-treaters along Dorset Street had all gone home, and the front door light at 2631 had been turned off, leaving the witch and the little patch of pumpkins in the front yard in darkness. Inside the small green house, the empty bowls of candy had been put away, and the 3 roommates were all looking forward to a quiet Sunday evening before the start of a new work week. Adrian was the only one of the women who had plans to go out that night. As she got ready to go visit her boyfriend, Christian Lee, who lived only a few blocks away, Lauren and Leslie settled onto the couch to watch one of their favorite TV shows. At 9:30 p.m., Leslie got a call on her phone and headed upstairs, where she would get another 2 calls, this time from the father of one of her ex-boyfriends that she'd left behind in South Carolina. Looking at the 2 calls come in, Leslie sighed and let them go to voicemail. She'd listen to them later, or not at all. Suddenly tired, Leslie called a good night down to Lauren, and a few minutes later, Leslie was in bed. Meanwhile, Adrian's visit with Christian had ended in an argument. Adrian was ready for the 2 of them to make a serious commitment to one another, but Christian was not ready. As Adrian left Christian's a little after 10 p.m. and began heading home, all she could think about was Lily. Here, Adrian was wanting more from her partner, Christian, while 4 months ago, her best friend, Lily, had moved in the opposite direction with her partner, canceling or at least delaying her plans to marry Eric. Letting herself through the door of 2631 about a half hour later, Adrian reminded herself that love was just not easy. And after saying hello to Lauren and her dog Chloe, Adrian made her way up the stairs to her bedroom, directly across the tiny landing from Leslie's bedroom. By 11 p.m., Lauren and Chloe were also tucked in for the night in Lauren's downstairs bedroom. Just a few minutes before, after letting Chloe outside in the backyard one final time, Lauren had done what the last person to bed always did. She'd made sure all the doors were locked, including the garage door and the back sliding door. Then she had turned out all the indoor and outdoor lights, glanced one last time around the cozy house she called home, stepped inside her bedroom, and closed the bedroom door behind her. 2.5 hours later, a little after 1:30 in the morning, Lauren woke up suddenly to a flash of bright light and a bark from Chloe, who was lying on the bed next to her. Outside her window, the motion sensor light attached to the garage had clicked on. Lauren waited, listening, but heard nothing. Turning back over in her bed, Lauren murmured to Chloe that it must have been a neighborhood cat out on the prowl. But just minutes later, Lauren found herself wide awake a second time, and this time it wasn't the outside light. This time she'd been awakened by a sound coming from inside the house. Shushing her growling dog, Lauren listened intently, and she heard quiet footsteps making their way up the stairs towards the second floor where the other 2 roommates were sleeping. Lauren's first thought was that Leslie must have broken their new house rule and invited a man over to spend the night, and that was him kind of sneaking into the house to be with her. Annoyed, Lauren did her best to quiet Chloe and go back to sleep. But just a few minutes later, at about 2 a.m., in the early morning hours of November 1st, Lauren heard the first scream. Lauren and her dog instantly bolted upright. It was obvious that that scream had not been from lovemaking. And a moment later, Lauren's confusion turned to panic and terror as she heard a second scream coming from upstairs, followed by the sound of a violent struggle in the room directly above her. Furniture being shoved aside, things falling on the floor, the stamping of bare feet and shoes. And then Lauren heard Adrian's voice raised to a shout. "Oh my God, please help! Please help!" Without turning her light on, Lauren stumbled out of her bed. She opened the door of her room and took one step into the dark hallway. For half a minute, Lauren just stood there listening, paralyzed with shock and fear, until suddenly she heard the sound of the glass light fixture at the top of the second floor landing break. And then she heard pounding footsteps as the intruder seemed to fly down the stairs 2 or 3 at a time, coming directly towards her. Jolted into action by a huge rush of adrenaline, Lauren reached down, grabbed Chloe, and turned toward the back door of the house. But no sooner had she stepped through the sliding door onto the patio and out onto the cold, damp grass than Lauren realized her mistake. The backyard was completely surrounded by a 6-foot-high fence, with no way for Lauren to escape. Terrified, Lauren dragged Chloe with her into a thicket of bushes, and just above the thudding of her own heart, Lauren could suddenly hear, from inside the house, the clack of the wooden window blinds in the kitchen. The sound told her one thing. The intruder had not followed her into the backyard. They were somewhere in the front of the house where the kitchen was. And then, when the clacking sound stopped, Lauren thought she heard a window break. Whoever had been inside the house must have left. And then, in the sudden quiet, Lauren heard it again. Adrian's faint but desperate cries for help. A moment later, Lauren crawled out from the cover of the bushes, and then, feeling her way in the darkness, she re-entered the house through the back door, and as carefully and quietly as she could, she picked up the receiver of the kitchen phone to call 911. But all she heard was the beep 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 of a busy signal. And in her mind's eye, Lauren pictured the phone upstairs, the receiver knocked off its hook during that terrible struggle she'd heard just a few minutes earlier. Lauren put the phone down, and then, taking a deep breath and praying she was right, that the intruder was gone, she tiptoed to the front of the house, turned, and then began to climb the stairs. She was careful not to touch the dark smears along the right side of the staircase that she knew were blood, focusing instead on the light that was coming from one of the bedrooms. Reaching the tiny landing, Lauren stepped around the broken glass light fixture on the floor and turned so she was looking through the door into Leslie's room. But before Lauren could even register the feeling of wet blood on the floor under her bare feet, Lauren saw Adrian. Her friend was crouching in a narrow space between the wall and Leslie's bed. But something was terribly wrong. Adrian's face and neck and arms were covered in blood. As Lauren rushed over to help her friend, Adrian made an effort to speak, but all Lauren heard was a long, gurgling breath deep in Adrian's throat. It was at that point that Lauren noticed something else. On top of the bed, in a pile of blankets and clothes, she saw the body of her other roommate. Leslie lay face down and motionless, with deep cuts all across her back and upper arms. Lauren tried not to slip in the blood as she backpedaled out of Adrian's room. Turning on the landing, Lauren ran down the stairs, she grabbed her cell phone out of her bedroom, and she punched in 911. By the time police and medical emergency vehicles had pulled up to the curb outside 2631 Dorset Street at 2:13 a.m., Lauren and her dog Chloe were still sitting inside of Lauren's car. Afraid that whoever had attacked her friends might come back for her, Lauren had grabbed her dog, jumped into her car, cell phone pressed to her ear, and driven up and down the street as she begged the emergency dispatch operator to send help, and did her best to describe what had happened. She said, "Both my roommates are hurt. I think they're dying." The first officers on the scene set up a loose defensive perimeter around the house. Before letting the emergency personnel inside 2631, 4 other officers, guns drawn, cleared the inside of the little house to make sure it really was empty, except for the 2 victims. The police, who had reached Adrian just before she died, later described the carnage in the upstairs bedrooms as the bloodiest crime they'd ever seen. Meanwhile, wrapped in a blanket and standing outside the house, Lauren told an officer trained in questioning victims of trauma all that she could remember about the attack, from the moment the light flicked on in the backyard to the calls she had just made to 911 operators. And as Lauren would repeat over and over again to police and later to the families of Adrian and Leslie, no. At no point had Lauren seen the intruder's face or noticed any details that would help police identify who had attacked her roommates. And no, Lauren had absolutely no idea who would want to hurt either Leslie or Adrian. By 2:30 a.m. on November 1st, the little house on Dorset Street, surrounded by yellow crime scene tape, was lit up in the glow of portable floodlights. Most crime scenes yield maybe 2 to 3 pieces of physical evidence, but over the next 2 days, the crime scene techs, who were now combing the inside and outside of 2631, would collect a whopping 71 pieces of evidence. Meanwhile, as small groups of neighbors began to gather together in the street, whispering to each other and calling out questions to the police, Napa police detective Todd Schulman was already giving the orders that would get the investigation going. The 4-year veteran investigator assigned officers to canvass neighbors and the growing crowd outside to see if anyone remembered seeing anything or anyone that night that was out of place or suspicious. And based on what Lauren had been able to tell police about her roommates' work, personal and social lives, the detective also ordered his team to start interviewing friends, coworkers, boyfriends, and acquaintances of the 2 victims. And by mid-morning, 7 hours after Adrian and Leslie were murdered, police would be knocking on the doors of Adrian's best friend, Lily Prudhomme, and Adrian's boyfriend, Christian Lee. Further away, at the vineyard where Leslie worked, her co-workers would also be questioned by police, and as police began gathering information about Leslie's social life, so would a long list of Leslie's current and former boyfriends. But even as police fanned out around Napa and began working the phones to trace Leslie's connections in South Carolina and Georgia, crime scene techs had already collected evidence that would wind up making a big cut in the possible pool of suspects. By Thursday, November 3rd, 4 days after the early morning double murder, the police knew that the killer was a male, a finding that ruled out the female half of the US population. Forensic investigators had been able to collect several critical pieces of physical evidence from the crime scene that would all contain samples of the killer's DNA. There was a packet of plastic zip ties, the kind that could be used to bind a person's wrists, that the killer had dropped just under the front window where they entered and then later exited the house. There was also a smear of blood that did not belong to the victims on the aluminum siding of the house near the window. And finally, police had found 3 cigarette butts in the front and backyard of 2631. DNA from all 3 pieces of evidence was identical, and it showed, without a doubt, that the killer was a man. Unfortunately, what the DNA did not reveal was the identity of this man. The DNA would turn out not to match the DNA sample that police had collected from Adrian's boyfriend, Christian, and when the DNA results were run through a nationwide database of more than 4 million known criminal offenders, there was no match there either. Although the police would not release this information to the public for another 2 weeks, the DNA results did clear any females, including Lauren and Lily, of any involvement in the murders. And even though Detective Schulman could not completely rule out the possibility that the murders of Adrian and Leslie were just the result of a burglary gone horribly wrong, the DNA results showing the killer was a man did support the investigators' emerging theory of the murder. The violence of the attack suggested the killer had a personal motive. And with Adrian's boyfriend off the suspect list, and given the number of men who had been close to or involved with Leslie, police began to focus on Leslie as the killer's prime target. And Adrian must have just been in the wrong place at the wrong time, a witness who had to be eliminated. Still, there was a second theory about these murders, a theory that would make this case even harder to solve, and one that was already keeping terrified residents of Napa awake at night. That theory was that the murders were the work of a serial killer, a person with no connection to their victims, a killer who might strike again at any moment or leave without a trace and continue to kill somewhere else. Within days of the murders, local security companies saw an uptick in the number of people in Napa County requesting the installation of alarm systems. And by November 9th, the day of Adrian's funeral, the 350 mourners who watched a video showing Adrian's progression through life from childhood to engineer were talking to one another in hushed whispers about a killer who could be lurking in every backyard. One day later, on Wednesday, November 10th, the city of Napa offered a $100,000 reward, money collected from local businesses, for information leading to the arrest and conviction of whoever had killed Adrian and Leslie. But despite the size of that reward, and despite the long list of potential suspects in the murder, most of them connected in some way to Leslie Mazzara, as November 2004 came to a close, police had still not made any arrests. And by December 2nd, 1 month after the Halloween night murders, Napa's police commander was offering a very sobering update on the investigation. So far, progress had consisted of what police figured out had not happened at 2631 Dorset Street. Investigators had ruled out domestic violence. They had also ruled out any gang-related connections to the murder, a lead that popped up when they found out that Leslie's father was serving back-to-back life sentences in Florida for his role in a murder conspiracy. Adrian's boyfriend, Christian, had also been ruled out as a suspect, along with that father of one of Leslie's ex-boyfriends who had called Leslie twice the night before she was killed, and the handyman who had been working on the roommate's house on Halloween Day. But according to the commander, the lack of progress had nothing to do with a lack of effort on the part of law enforcement. In the days after the murders, several other high-profile agencies had joined forces with the Napa police. Those included a response team from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Napa County Major Crime Investigations Team, the California Department of Justice, and a handful of recently retired local detectives who had been rehired to help investigate this case. And behind the scenes, police had collected DNA swabs from almost 200 men who had some connection with the victims, and investigators had conducted nearly 1,000 interviews across 8 different states. Still, it just wasn't enough. Standing up in front of a packed press conference, the commander of the Napa Police Department told the public that 1 month after the murder, law enforcement had nothing to indicate that they were going to solve this case, quote, today, tomorrow, or next week, end quote. And if anything, that prediction turned out to be a very big understatement. Because over the next 10 months, the only breakthrough on the case was the use of a new DNA analysis tool that allowed police to further narrow down their suspect pool. In addition to knowing that the murderer was male, police now knew with good certainty that he was also of Northern European descent with possibly blonde hair and blue or green eyes. But while this ruled out suspects of color, it wasn't enough of a break to lead police to their killer. In the meantime, as the investigation dragged on, friends of Adrian and Leslie tried very hard to keep the memory of these 2 women alive and to move forward with their own lives. In between candlelight vigils, fundraisers, and interviews with the media about Adrian and Leslie, there was only one bright spot. Inviting their friends and Adrian's family to join them, Lily and Eric got married in a celebration of life service at the Big White Episcopal Church on 3rd Street in Napa. It would not be until the fall of 2005, almost a year after Adrian and Leslie were murdered, that investigators finally got the break they needed to solve the so-called Halloween homicides. After basically running out of options for kickstarting an investigation that had ground to a halt, the Napa Police Department had decided to go public with one of the details in the case that they had been keeping a secret. Holding back evidence is a common practice in investigations. Investigators like to use undisclosed information to help confirm whether a suspect actually knows details about the crime that have not been made public. It also helps police rule out false confessions. In this case, the detail related to the cigarette butts that had been picked up by crime scene techs in the front and backyards of 2631 Dorset Street early on the morning of the murders. In August 2005, 9 months after those cigarette butts were collected and tested for DNA, further analysis had revealed that the cigarettes themselves, Camel Turkish Golds, were very unusual. Not only did the cigarettes have distinctive markings around the filter, they had only been on the market for 14 months, and they were only sold in Napa by a handful of stores. A month later, on September 21st, in a last-ditch effort to jog the memory of anyone who might know a smoker of Turkish Gold cigarettes, Detective Schulman released the name and description of the cigarettes to the local media, calling the information an important new piece of evidence in the Halloween murders. And for one television viewer, that evening's headline story about these Camel Turkish Gold cigarettes immediately struck a nerve. Sitting in a house just 2 miles away from the place where Adrian and Leslie had been killed 11 months earlier, the viewer suddenly stiffened up in his chair and turned up the volume on the TV set. As the newscaster ran through the latest details in the murder investigation, the young man watching knew that he had information that could be vital to the police trying to solve this case. Leaning forward, the young man clicked through other news stations on TV to see if he could find out any more information on what police were calling a breakthrough. 5 days later, on September 27th, Detective Schulman got a call from the Napa police station. Someone had just walked into the station asking for a detective and said he had important eyewitness testimony related to the murders of Adrian and Leslie. Based on this person's information, along with follow-up interviews and additional investigation by law enforcement, here is a reconstruction of what police and forensic experts believe happened to Adrian Insania and Leslie Mazzara on the night they were killed. For the killer, Sunday, October 31st, 2004, was a day of terrible disappointment. And at that party, on that Halloween night, as the killer looked around the table at the people sitting there and playing cards with him, his feelings of jealousy, anger, and resentment just kept getting stronger and stronger. Those feelings were helped along by all the alcohol, 1 drink for every hand of cards he lost, and the killer was losing the game badly. By the time the killer had been driven back to his house, he was so drunk he had trouble standing up, and by the time he stumbled into the empty apartment, he couldn't even remember getting dropped off at his own front door. But sometime after midnight, after waking up from a short sleep, the killer was sober enough to make a plan for that night and early morning that did not involve going back to bed. Instead, the killer had decided to go confront at least one of the people that he held responsible for the emotional pain he was feeling. And on his way out to his car, the killer stopped in his garage and put together his murder kit, a packet of plastic ties secured with a rubber band, and a sharp knife with a 4 to 5 inch long blade. Then, just before hopping into his car and heading for his destination, the killer patted his coat pocket, making sure he had a pack of his favorite cigarettes, the only brand he smoked now, Camel Turkish Gold. 10 minutes later, when the killer arrived at the little house at 2631 Dorset Street, he parked the car across the street and turned off the engine. Before getting out, he sat for a while in the darkness, looking at the orange pumpkins on the lawn and the witch with the green face twisting from one of the ceiling rafters of the front porch. Then the killer opened the car door and walked across the street until he was facing the closed white garage door of 2631. Standing there quietly, he pulled out his packet of cigarettes and began to smoke, while he lifted his eyes to stare at the upstairs windows. When he flicked one of his cigarette butts out of his hand and into the grass, the sudden movement was picked up by a motion sensor and the backyard light suddenly turned on, temporarily blinding him. But even though this startled him, and he might have even considered turning around and going back home, he ultimately decided to continue with his plan. He moved from the white garage doors across the front lawn to the front door, where he gently tried turning the knob. But the door was locked. However, that didn't mean the windows were locked too. Taking out his knife, the killer stepped from the door over to one of the front windows. And sure enough, when he inserted the blade between the windowsill and the window sash, he could feel the upward give as he pried the window open. And once he was able to slip his fingers under the sash, it was easy to push the window open all the way, giving him plenty of room to crawl inside. On his way into the house, the killer didn't notice that he had dropped his packet of zip ties secured with a rubber band that had soaked up a sample of his sweat and DNA. Once inside, the killer let his eyes adjust to the darkness, and then he stepped a little to his right, towards the stairs that led to the 2 upper bedrooms. Once upstairs, the killer turned into Leslie's room first. Seeing the sleeping woman on the bed in front of him, he stepped closer and stared down at her. Then, raising his knife high in the air, the murderer brought it down with all his force directly into Leslie's heart. Leslie had time for one short scream before the killer raised the knife and stabbed her again and again. But that scream had been enough to wake up Adrienne in the little bedroom across the hall. Switching on the light, she could see that someone, an intruder, was inside of Leslie's room. A moment later, and Adrienne was out of bed and stepping through the open door across the hallway to help her friend and roommate. The killer looked up, locked eyes with Adrienne, and then he attacked, striking her with the knife. And when Adrienne fought back, the killer struck again and again and again, leaving cuts and wounds all over her upper body, arms, and hands, along with a deep gash across her face and neck. The frenzied attack had left blood everywhere, in pools on the floor and spatter marks along the walls and the bed. But from the very start of their struggle, Adrienne had begun to shout and call out for help, and she did not stop. And even as Adrienne began to bleed out, her cries were so loud that the killer panicked. Running out of the bedroom, he turned on the landing, smashed the glass light fixture on the wall before pounding down the steps, taking them 2 and 3 at a time, leaving streaks of bright red blood where his fingers had touched the wall. Once he reached the bottom of the stairs, the killer raced for the front window, causing the wooden blinds to clatter as he jimmied himself through the opening and back out onto the front porch. This time, the smear of blood he left on the exterior aluminum siding was his own. At some point, he had cut himself, leaving a clear DNA marker alongside the window. A moment later, the killer had reached his car, yanked open the driver's side door, thrown the bloody knife onto the back seat, and headed for the freeway that would take him home. It's believed the killer either didn't know Lauren was still there at the property, or he simply was too panicked from all the screaming and chaos happening upstairs that he did not want to stick around any longer. Either way, Lauren was ultimately spared. Back at his apartment, the killer stripped off his blood-stained clothes and took them out to the backyard. Building a fire in the fire pit, he fed the clothes and his shoes into the bright orange flames. Later that same morning, when Lily Prudhomme heard the news that Leslie and Lily's own best friend Adrian had been murdered, Lily was absolutely heartbroken. And the one person who was there right from the start to help her cope with this terrible loss was her boyfriend and killer, Eric Koppel. It would turn out that Eric Koppel had been devastated when Lily had called off their wedding back in August of 2004. He knew he had a drinking problem, and he knew he suffered from deep depression, but to Eric, Lily was the most important person in his life, and he could not imagine living without her. Despite canceling their wedding, the two of them were still living together, and on Halloween, the two of them had gone to a party together, where Eric would start playing a drinking card game. But the more Eric drank at that party, the more he kept thinking that October 31st was just hours away from the day, November 1st, 2004, that should have been his wedding day. And instead of getting married to Eric, Lily had planned to spend what would have been their honeymoon on a trip not with him, but with her best friend Adrian, one of the people, Eric was sure of this, who had probably told Lily that she could do much better than Eric. But it wasn't until Eric had made one final plea that night, asking Lily again to marry him and set a new date for their wedding, that Eric's bitterness overflowed. Lily, angry at how intoxicated Eric was, said no to his marriage proposal, and when she drove him home that night, she didn't stay with him at their apartment. Instead, she went to her parents' house. As Eric Koppel would later tell police when he confessed to the double murder of Adrian and Leslie, he only remembered bits and pieces of what happened in the early hours of November 1st. He would never say exactly why he had killed the two women, and his own story of how he had committed the murders was different from the reconstruction police had put together based on forensic evidence and the autopsy reports on Leslie and Adrian. According to Eric, he had gone first to Adrian's room to lie down and sleep on a pile of blankets at the foot of her bed. When Adrian woke up, turned on the light, and saw Eric, he attacked her to keep her from crying out. And then, forgetting exactly how or why, Eric told police he had gone into Leslie's room and stabbed her too before running down the stairs and leaving by the front window. And after the murders, Eric had been such a comfort to Lily that 5 months later, the two of them were married in a ceremony that featured a special reading by none other than Adrian's mother, Arlene Allen. Eric made his confession to police on September 27th, 5 days after he had seen on TV the news story in which police linked the killer in the Halloween murders to a white male with light hair and eyes who smoked Camel Turkish Gold cigarettes. It was a brand that was so distinctive that when police had asked Lauren if she or Adrian or Leslie knew anyone who smoked Turkish Golds, Lauren was able to give investigators one name, Eric Koppel. Eric was one of the people who had helped Adrian move into the little house on Dorset Street back in February of 2004, 8 months before Adrian and Leslie were killed. And Eric was one of the only members of Adrian's inner circle who had never been questioned by police or asked for a DNA sample. By the time the news story about the cigarettes had aired, Eric could already feel the net tightening around him. He knew from earlier news coverage that police had recovered the killer's DNA from the scene, and that the blood, saliva, tissue, and sweat were his. And as the killer's DNA profile came into clearer focus, a white male of Northern European descent with light hair and light eyes, who smoked these Turkish Gold cigarettes, it was a face Eric recognized every time he looked into a mirror. After starting in late summer, before Turkish Gold cigarettes had made the headlines, police, acting on Lauren's tip, had already begun calling Eric. Until then, Eric had slipped below police radar. A quiet and religious 26-year-old land surveyor, he did not appear to have close personal ties with either Adrian or Leslie. And while police collected 218 DNA samples from men known to be among the victim's circle of friends and acquaintances, they did not collect any samples from Eric. When Eric arrived at the police station on September 27th, 11 months after he had killed Adrian and Leslie, he didn't come alone. After seeing the TV news story about the Turkish Gold cigarettes, Eric apparently wrote suicide letters to his family. In response to those letters, his family urged him to go to the police. And so when Eric walked alone into the police interrogation room, the family members who had accompanied him sat waiting for him in the lobby. Despite the differences between the police reconstruction of the crime and the story that Eric told them, Eric Koppel was immediately arrested and charged with first-degree murder in the deaths of Adrian Insania and Leslie Mazzara. Police were very skeptical that Eric could be sober enough to plan and carry out 2 murders, stand outside his victim's house smoking cigarettes, and later destroy evidence of his crime, but also be so drunk that he was unable to remember actually stabbing and killing his victims, and unable to recall what he had done with the murder weapon, which was never found. On Tuesday, December 5th, 2006, just 2 months after the second anniversary of the Halloween murders, Eric Koppel pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder. That guilty plea meant that the families of his victims would be spared a potentially painful jury trial, and it also meant that Eric would not face a possible death sentence. Instead, Eric was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He is currently serving his time at Corcoran Prison, a correction center in California designed specifically to house inmates who have a substance abuse disorder. At Eric's sentencing, Adrian's best friend, Lily, told a packed courtroom there was nothing in the world that Eric could do to make her love him less. 2 years later, though, in 2008, the couple got a divorce. Later, Lily would enroll as a graduate student at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, where she would write a doctoral dissertation on forgiveness. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please offer to pick up